All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series and Podcast. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Daniel Pipes, President here at the Middle East Forum, and whom has just completed his latest book with the working title, Israel Victory, How Zionists Win Acceptance and Palestinians Get Liberated. Join us to discuss Making Sense of the Hamas-Israel War. Mr. Pipes will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Daniel Pipes.
Thank you, Stacey, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be back on the Middle East Forum podcast. I actually initiated this series almost 4 years ago in March of 2020. And it's my first time back as a speaker. We've had some close to 600 podcasts. So I thank the many, many speakers who have joined us, and in particular, Ashley Perry, who has done roughly a third of them every Wednesday. So thank you to all, and thank you to Stacey for your great moderation through all these years. As you heard, I've just finished a book on Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And so I watch what's happened since October 7th with a special interest. And I'd like to take up 5 topics, which I find somewhat mystifying and would try and clarify. I'll go through 4 of them fairly quickly and dwell more on the final one. Sorry about my voice. First point is, what's wrong with the Israeli military and more broadly the security establishment? How could it let something like October 7th happen? And I would answer that I think that the first Zionist and then Israeli security establishment, the military, the intelligence, the other security services, law enforcement, have been in rather precipitous decline over the past century. The Zionists were very clever and very accomplished when they had few means. And the Israelis won an extraordinary war of independence in 1948-49. They won what was probably the most lopsided victory in modern history in 1967. And then from then on, which is now over half a century, they have been in decline. Famously, in 1973, they failed to see what was coming from Syria and Egypt. But there were further terrible problems. In 1993, the Oslo Accords made no sense at all. To bring in your most violent and vehement enemy to be your neighbor and nearly sovereign. 2005, to leave Gaza and allow your enemy to take over there. The Israeli security establishment is not what it used to be. And so 2023 comes not as such a great shock after 1973, 1993, 2005. Not what it used to be. It needs a real kick, such as it just got, in order to recognize its deep problems. Second, while the Israelis responded to October 7th with a great deal of talk about victory, which was music to my ears, I think they quickly reverted to a non-victory approach. One sees over the last 3 months and a bit a lot of reversion. For example, even though the Gazan workers are now in retrospect understood to have been spies, the Israelis immediately allowed in some 6,000 West Bank workers, who presumably could be spies as well. The Israeli government decided to send monies to the Palestinian Authority. It has been appeasing Qatar as an intermediary. It has been supplying Gaza with fuel and water. It has been ignoring the threat of West Bank building. There's talk of allowing the Hamas leadership to flee Gaza and set up somewhere else, perhaps in Qatar, Turkey. And there has been a surge in support, not for those who are intent on ending Hamas's presence, but on those who are more moderate and less intent on victory. So I don't think there has been a fundamental change. As in the United States after 9/11, when everything changed, so unheard in Israel after October 7th, I don't think everything changed. I think what we're seeing is a reversion to the mean. Then third point, looking at the responses to October 7th, I think there are two responses. One is that around the world, from the United States to Saudi Arabia to India and beyond, you see that the establishment has favored Israel, while the Islamists and the leftists have favored Hamas. So there wasn't much attention paid, but the U.S. House, voted 410 to 12 or 412 to 10, I forgot which, in favor of Israel. Very strong resolution right after the massacre. The Senate voted 100 to 0. Joe Biden came out with very strong statements. Liberal figures like John Fetterman, the senator from Pennsylvania, came out very strongly for Israel. One saw many European leaders go to Israel, stand with in solidarity. But then over time, sympathy has eroded. Sympathy for Israel has eroded, and that for Hamas has increased. There's been a deep unease with Israel doing roughly what the United States and its allies did against ISIS, going in and taking out the enemy. Deep unease. And the Israelis are losing support all the time. Fourth point is that Hamas has a unique logic. I don't know of any historical example comparable to Hamas. Hamas seeks death and destruction. It doesn't seek to win on the battlefield. It seeks to lose. It seeks for the people that it governs to be harmed, to be bombed, to be homeless, to be hungry, to be dead. This is Hamas's approach. It is using the Gazans as cannon fodder, but not the usual kind of cannon fodder, which goes and attacks the enemy. This is cannon fodder which suffers. And you can see how different Hamas is from Hezbollah in Lebanon and the PA and the West Bank. Both of them are far more conventional. They assess, they look, they make trouble, they play games, but they don't look to get smashed. Hezbollah inadvertently in 2006 killed a couple of Israelis, captured, I think, 3 Israelis, and that led to all-out war. And right after the all-out war, the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, said, you know what, if I'd known this would happen, we wouldn't have captured and killed those soldiers. He thought that there was understanding, that you keep it simmering, which is in fact the case right now. There's a simmering between Hezbollah and Israel. Hezbollah is careful not to provoke, careful not to get F-35s screeching over Lebanon and bombing things. Hamas is not careful. Hamas wants to have death and destruction. The West Bank, under the Palestinian Authority, is much more careful. Mahmoud Abbas plays games. He works with the Israelis here. He murders them there. But he's careful. He doesn't want to be bombed. He doesn't want to be overthrown. He doesn't want to be destroyed in the way that Hamas does. And I believe that Hamas is unique in this logic of losing in order to get sympathy from its allies, in particular the Islamists around the world, and the hard left, especially the left in general and the hard left in particular. And it works to a certain extent. As I just mentioned, support for Israel has eroded over the last 3 months. My final point is to try and understand the allies of Hamas. They have engaged in a campaign that is hard to understand. It's extremely aggressive. It looks counterproductive. For example, the pro-Hamas elements in the United States have disrupted parades. The Thanksgiving Day parade in New York City, the Rose Bowl parade in Pasadena. Uh, they have disrupted traffic major ways to such airports as LAX and JFK. They have blocked Manhattan one early morning, Monday morning, blocking bridges and tunnel, creating havoc. They have attacked Christian ceremonies, Christian carol events, raising money for the blind in Melbourne, Australia. Christmas party of Democratic operatives in Detroit. They have attacked the military. They have vocally, and in some cases, tried to make trouble for Air Force bases. They serenaded Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, with horrible ditties outside his home on Christmas morning. They have made themselves obnoxious. Why? And then in another level entirely, the Houthis are doing the same in the Red Sea. They're making themselves obnoxious. They have little to gain by interrupting global commerce. They gain nothing by having ships go around the Horn of Africa rather than through the Suez Canal. It doesn't do them good. It seems gratuitous. Also, the Iran-backed militias in Syria and Iraq have attacked American forces over 100 times in the 100 days since October 7th, more than once a day. So between these antics in the West and these attacks, lethal attacks in the Middle East, what's going on? Are these hostile actions merely self-indulgent, or are they part of some clever strategy? Now, they certainly seem to harm the Hamas cause. The Melbourne audience, for example, booed heartily those who had ruined the fundraiser by screaming anti-Zionist slogans. The Christmas revelers in Detroit were extremely annoyed by the disruption and recalled the Black Arab tensions that have been in that city for decades. When the police eventually cleared the protesters in Pasadena, the crowd burst into cheers. Interfering with supply chains in the Red Sea alienates governments, businesses, and consumers worldwide. So the goal obviously is not to win friends. Rather, what these allies of Hamas are doing, I suggest, is to imitate the tactics that I just delineated of Hamas. The goal is martyrdom, symbolic or real, to win Islamist and leftist support. Now, this is highly unusual. Again, jihadis normally want to win on the battlefield. Hamas has purposely initiated conflicts against the more powerful enemy, the Israeli military, wanting to be smashed so it can become the victim. Destruction and death serve as its appeal. Hamas wins politically by losing militarily. Following Hamas, its American and Mideast groups, or Western and Mideast groups, also aspire to win sympathy and support by losing. Disrupting Christmas parties, football game parades, New York City traffic, and storming the White House, as they did just a couple of days ago, all goad law enforcement into at least arresting the protesters and maybe even beating them up. Likewise, the Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping and the proxy attacks on U.S. forces in Syria and Iraq intend to provoke an overwhelming U.S. retaliation. Seen thus, massacring Israelis, disrupting world trade, and inconveniencing American motorists are not the primary goal, but a means to the end, which is to bait Israeli and American forces, and thereby to aggrandize Hamas, the Houthis, and their many allies. It works, for those allies do find such displays inspiring. Note in particular how Gazan suffering has replaced the Israeli trauma. But this victimization game plays with fire. A step too far, such as the October 7th massacre, or possibly a Houthi destruction of an oil tanker, or fatalities at US military bases, risks jeopardizing the very existence of these martyr organizations. And therefore, I conclude that despite their impressive short-term successes, I think that overreaching and therefore failure are appear to be their eventual fate.
All right. Thank you so much for that. We have quite a few questions coming in. JL asks, is the two-state solution essentially dead, and was it always a Western fantasy?
I don't think so. I think it's a fantasy now, given that the PA or any other Palestinian group seeks the destruction of Israel. But one day, if there is an Israel victory and a Palestinian defeat and a Palestinian giving up on the rejectionist goals, yes, there can be. So it's not possible anytime soon, but as an abstract possibility, yes, it's conceivable.
Thank you. Eric Selkov asks, do you think the Israeli objectives for the Hamas war were realistic in lieu of the world politics and the entrenched Hamas ideology in Gaza?
Well, we all called for destruction, elimination of Hamas, me, myself included, at the very beginning. And now, 100 days on, it's a little murky as to what exactly this means. I think what it means is, one, the ending of any Hamas control in Gaza, and two, the reduction or perhaps even elimination of its funding by states. The ideas will continue, but the organization need not. So, no, I don't think it's unrealistic. It is realistic, and the Israelis are determined. Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a talk yesterday, day before, in which he said, we are determined to have total victory. So, and no one's going to stop us, not the International Court of Justice, not our allies. We're going to go for this. They seem determined. Good for them.
Thank you. On that note, Larry Greenberg asks, given the geopolitics, can Israel really extract itself from the vassalage to the U.S.?
Well, vassalage is a strong term. The U.S. is a great power, the great power. Israel is a small country, 330 million versus 10 million. Israel cannot build its own fighter aircraft, its own naval vessels, and so forth. Israel needs allies, and in particular the United States. But there is horse trading going on. Israelis can bargain, not just for money, but also for leverage. The Israelis have alternatives that they can turn to. The United States needs Israel. It's not just Israel needs the United States. The United States needs Israel. The Middle East is at the center of the world. It's extremely volatile. There is no other country in the region that shares our values and with which we have a strategic alliance. Turkey was that way, but not for the past 20 years. So Israel stands alone in the Middle East. We need it. It needs us. So I don't think it's vassalage. These are the tensions inherent in an alliance between a great power and a small power.
Very well put. Kenneth Gross asks, what will it take for the U.S. to demand a surrender by Hamas as opposed to this ceasefire mission? If the U.S. were to stand up to Hamas, there would still be multiple protests here, but would that we won't make the situation worse by siding with Israel, correct?
Well, the United States has become an active military ally of Israel without saying so much. The United States has, within the last few days, killed a number of Houthis and attacked a number of Houthi installations in Yemen. This was not portrayed as something helpful to Israel, but rather for freedom of navigation. But in fact, the United States and Israel are on the same side. So that alliance has deepened. Also, earlier, maybe in October, November, U.S. ships shot down missiles going from Yemen to Israel, something that had not happened before. So things are changing. And while there's a reluctance on both sides, Israeli and American, to note what I just said. I think it is a new reality.
Thank you. And I will follow up with a question of my own on that one. You mentioned the establishment versus the Islamist and leftist support for Hamas. Can the establishment stay strong with Israel, and or will it cave to the Islamist and leftist pressure?
Well, there are three groups, basically. You have the anti-Israel left. By the way, I don't use the word pro-Palestinian. They're not in the least pro-Palestinian. They're anti-Israel. They couldn't care less about Palestinians. There's the anti-Israel cohort, which is primarily on the left and which is vehemently against Israel. Jeremy Corbyn, for example, has joined the South African effort at the ICJ. And then you have those who are supporting Israel, strongly supporting Israel, and unwavering in their support. And then you have those in the middle who feel the pressures. Joe Biden would be a perfect example. His instinct is friendly to Israel, but there are plenty in the Democratic Party who are hostile to Israel. So he's trying to have it both ways. He's trying to please both sides. The diplomatic missions of Antony Blinken reflect the confusion of this position, where this middle group, which includes many Western governments, including the American, where they will land is still unclear. But so far, they have basically stood by Israel, providing arms, as I just mentioned, in effect, siding with Israel militarily. They have wavered. They're no longer where they were 3 months ago, but they are still there. So I think the record suggests that this middle group will waveringly stick with Israel.
Thank you very much. Stephen asks, given what we know now about the scope, extent, and sophistication of the underground city and tunnel systems, how could this have been developed without the knowledge of the Israeli intelligence? And given that UNRWA is so embedded in every aspect of Gaza, is it not possible or credible that the UN body could not have been aware of the intent of this?
Well, UNRWA is not defending Israel. The Israelis basically knew. They called it the Metro. They knew about the tunnels, but what they didn't know is that Hamas was ready to attack in the way it did on October 7th. They had this notion that Hamas was settling in and becoming more a governing authority and was losing its revolutionary zeal. And Hamas played along with that and encouraged that. So the Israelis were blind to what they were seeing. They saw it, and there are plenty of reports of Israelis who, in the military, who were watching this, and the intelligence, and saw that that Hamas was preparing, but the high command just was blind to it. It was a conceptual problem. It was not an intelligence problem. It was a conceptual problem, and it's akin to the conceptual problem the Israelis had in 1973. They assumed that Anwar Sadat would not attack until he had more advanced planes. They just assumed it. So they didn't see what was coming because they had a concept, what they call in Hebrew, conceptia. They had a conceptia then, they had a conceptia now that caused them to be blind to the facts at their fingertips.
Thank you. J.R. Pride asks, the IJC seems to be anti-Israel in principle. How should Israel respond regardless of any decision by the IJC?
ICJ. I think the Israelis are doing the right thing, which is to go and present their case, to find someone who is got a good reputation internationally. They might well lose, but I don't know how consequential it is. Look, again, there are three parties. There are those who support Israel. There are those who are against Israel. And then there are those in the middle who are not quite sure. And all the attention is focused on them. Will they be influenced by the ICJ? Will they be influenced by the media coverage? Will they be influenced by a whole array of developments? But I would suggest that as time goes on, that middle tranche between pro and anti-Israel is getting smaller and smaller. More and more people, especially in the last 3 months, have picked sides and know what they think. And so My opinion will not be changed by the ICJs. Yours probably won't be changed by it. The number of people whose views will be affected by the ICJ verdict probably is not that great.
Fair point. Doris Rostrauss asks, where is China in all of this? What about China? Are they involved?
China's had a pretty good relationship with Israel for decades now, but that has seriously gone south. The TikTok, the Chinese social media, is vehemently anti-Semitic, and the Chinese government is siding ever more with the anti-Israel forces, Iran in particular. So China is coming out of the neutral zone into the hostile. And it makes sense because the United States is close to Israel. So China doesn't like Israel.
Thank you. Lev Brodney asks, how do we bring the kidnapped home alive?
My advice to the Israelis would be to de emphasize the hostages and not to make this a major focus of public attention, but to focus on victory. And I think that is the way to get them back alive, not through yellow ribbons and photographs of those missing. I think it's an enormous mistake. It would be smart to push that whole topic aside. Say to the hostage families, your your loved ones are very much on our mind. We're doing everything we can. We're not doing it by dealing with Qatar and Hamas. We're doing it by winning.
Thank you. Steve asks, where do you see the Israeli-Hezbollah face-off going?
As I mentioned earlier, Hezbollah is playing the game, knows the rules of the game. The Israelis know the rules of the game. In 2006, the Israelis broke the rules of the game. They're not likely to break them now. Hezbollah does not want to be smashed, sees that the Israelis are angry, and I think their last 3 months are likely to the low grade hostilities of the last 3 months are likely to continue. I would be surprised if it flares into all out war such as was in 2006 or now in Gaza. That Hezbollah doesn't want that.
Thank you. BPZ asks, any idea who will live and or govern Gaza after Israel's victory?
Well, I don't know who will. I know who I want. Um, I believe there are plenty of Gazans who despise Hamas and despise being used as cannon fodder for Hamas and who want normal lives. By normal lives, I mean lives comparable to those in Egypt, the West Bank, or Jordan, where they're not, well, let me not say the West Bank, Egypt or Jordan, where they're not particularly friendly to Israel, but they live side by side with Israel without making trouble. I think there is a body, a cohort of Gazans who will work with Israel to set up an administration, a police force, and govern the entity as a quasi-governmental agency. I think it's possible. And I very much hope the Israelis go in that direction. I hope the US government doesn't get in their way. This is the best thing for Gaza, the best thing for Israel.
Absolutely. And in our final few minutes here, Jonathan Green asks, what will total Israeli defeat of Hamas ultimately look like? Will there be a sit down and a signing of a surrender document a la Japan or Germany in World War II? Or will there be no Hamasniks left to surrender and the surrender will be assumed?
I don't think there has been a surrender ceremony since 1945. Perhaps there has been, but I can't think of any. No, there will not be any surrender ceremony, but there will be a collapse of Hamas authority and Hamas' ability to reach into Gaza and provoke hostilities against Israel. That would be victory for Israel.
Thank you so much. So sorry, I didn't actually plan another one. But yes, we have so very many questions left. I truly apologize that we have not gotten to all of them. They were
Oh,
fantastic,
we
but
can do another. We can do another 5 minutes.
oh, wonderful. Okay, so Steve asks, what does it take to allow Israelis in the north to return home?
Now, this is a big problem. that Hezbollah hostilities have disrupted the lives, caused hundreds of thousands of Israelis to have to move away from the northern border, the border with Lebanon. Uh, I think the Israelis need to reach some kind of one of these unofficial agreements with Hezbollah that they stop this. And they do that by making it clear to Hezbollah that this is unacceptable, that this cannot go on. And I think Hezbollah would recognize that, yeah, they can't keep 300,000 or so Israelis from living in their homes indefinitely. But the Israelis have a full plate and they focus more on Gaza than on Lebanon. So that hasn't happened yet.
Thank you. David Kaplan asked, how much is the conflict with Hamas similar to addressing the symptom and not the virus, i.e., Iran?
Ultimately, yeah, Iran is the head of the Hydra, and it is behind the attacks in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, Yemen. Who knows where they'll go next? Yeah, the Iranian regime has to be addressed. And in particular, the nuclear infrastructure has to be addressed. The Iranians are going ahead full speed. U.S. shows concern, but has made it clear it's not going to do anything. Who knows? That could be a feint, but at this point, there's no reason to disbelieve it. Yeah, Iran is the ultimate source of so many of the Middle East problems, and the U.S. government has never, since 1979, made it a goal to overthrow the government of Iran. We've never helped the dissidents to do anything, and particularly in 2009, we didn't do anything. A year plus ago, with the many demonstrations across the country, we didn't do anything. It's time to confront the real source of Mideast problems, namely Tehran.
Thank you. Jack Berkowitz asks, if the ICJ rules against Israel, isn't it possible that any and all officials, minister, even the PM, could be arrested while traveling abroad?
I'm not one to tell you the legal fine points of it, but it could well complicate Israeli lives in countries that would accept that verdict. And presumably Israelis would know which countries they are. But probably those are the countries that they wouldn't want to go to anyway. But yeah, you're right. It could complicate their lives, legally speaking.
Fair point. Thank you. Amelia Lubitz asks, has there been any consequences for the journalists accompanying Hamas's murderous rampage?
They've been noted and pointed out, but I don't know that they've been fired, much less penalized. Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you. Ethel asks, meanwhile, the slaughter in Russia, Ukraine continues with no outcry about the innocent civilians being killed. Why the different approach? Why, when Israel acts, is there such intense scrutiny?
Yeah, not just Ukraine, but are you aware of the 1027, not 107, but 1027 insurgency that took place in October in Myanmar, in Burma? A major, major effort by the insurgents to overthrow the horrible government there. Major event. You have to look hard to find any news coming out of it, much less Sudan or Eastern Congo or other much larger conflict zones. Yeah. Well, I think the essence is that when Westerners are involved against non-Westerners, it's news. And all the more so when it's Jewish Westerners, but Westerners in general, fighting non-Westerners, the Americans in Iraq or French in West Africa or other examples, it gets a lot more attention than when it's non-Westerners fighting non-Westerners.
Thank you. So Helena asks, what about Russia? Which side are they on? There's a lot of geopolitical questions here.
Well, this October 7th has had a lot of implications, places you'd never expect. I mean, Harvard University's president, never expect. The Russians have become ever more clearly aligned and uh, allied with Iran. And so they are ever more clear on that side. But the Russians don't need more enmity. So they're not making trouble for Israel gratuitously. They don't need Israel to make trouble for them. So there's a certain kind of ceasefire between Russia and Israel, particularly in Syria. They're not making trouble for each other. Maybe in the future, but not today.
Jack Wasserman asks, given that Hamas does not seek victory in Gaza, how will Israel determine its endpoint in the war?
Well, Hamas does seek victory, but not on the battlefield. It seeks it by finding support around the world. Uh, I answer the question the same way. Hamas needs to be eliminated from holding any kind of power in Gaza.
All right, thank you. And before we go, is there any chance for escalation of the Israel-Hamas war? Is there any indication that this could spread to Iran and the U.S. and world powers getting involved in this?
Well, it has. Yemen, Houthis, United States, Britain. It has already spread. It could spread to Lebanon. I don't think the Syrian government is looking for trouble with Israel, but it could spread in other ways. There are reports suggesting that Iranian insurgents and conspiracists are on the march in Jordan. Who knows? There are plenty of implications, far more than I ever would have imagined 3 months ago, and they've not stopped. Uh, in particular, the Houthi disruption of world trade has potential for all sorts of trouble. What if they do blow up an oil tanker? Imagine what comes after that. Yeah, it's potentially a lot more trouble ahead.
Thank you so much. These are troubling times, but I'm sure here at the Middle East Forum, we'll be keeping you all abreast of the situation and any uh, research that we find out and articles. All right, so thank you so much, Mr. Pipes. We have come to the close of our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us again for the first time in 4 years here.
My pleasure. Thank you for all the questions I see. There are plenty more. I'm sorry we can't get to them. Perhaps on another occasion.
Absolutely. We'll have to have you back. For our viewers, please join us Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.